The air hung heavy, thick with the silence of fear and the dust of abandoned fields. This was Israel under the heel of Midian, a land that had forgotten the sound of a free harvest. Every year, as the rich grain was set to ripen, the terror of the east would arrive. The Midianites, a multitude compared to locusts, descending from the desert with their camels and tents. They would strip the land bare, leaving behind a wake of starvation and despair. The people, once proud, were now reduced to living in caves and mountain strongholds, their spirit broken not just by the invaders, but by the deeper corrosion of spiritual apathy, a generation that had traded the living God for the dead comfort of Baal. This was a crisis not only of famine and physical oppression, but of absolute demoralization, where hope itself had become a dangerous luxury commodity. The sound that permeated their world was the distant, menacing low of Midianite cattle, the ultimate symbol of their humiliation and loss. Amidst this national tragedy, our gaze falls upon an unlikely theater of war, the winepress of his father, Joash. This was not a place for threshing wheat, but fear is a great distorting mirror, making a man seek darkness where he should seek light. Here was Gideon, a man whose lineage was the least in Manasseh, and he himself the smallest in his father's house, meticulously trying to preserve a meager portion of grain. He moved with the nervous efficiency of a thief, his heart pounding not from the effort of the flail, but from the constant, agonizing dread of being discovered. The scene was a visceral metaphor for the state of Israel, attempting to sustain life in the shadows, using the wrong tools in the wrong place, driven by a fear so profound it had become a physical weight. The prophet's profile was thus etched not in bronze, but in the grime of humility and the deep lines of a pervasive, consuming cowardice. It is in this shadow-drenched lagar, in the heart of this profound smallness, that the divine irony makes its entrance. The angel of the Lord sits beneath an oak, an eternal presence surveying a fleeting moment of human anxiety, and he utters a declaration that shatters Gideon's reality. "The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor." The contrast is absolute and electric, the celestial title bestowed upon a frightened farmer. This was not a congratulation on a battle won, but a declaration of a potential that only God saw. His authority, his coming power, would not be sourced from military academy training, noble birthright, or a position of influence, but entirely from the unmerited, transformative declaration of the Almighty. The divine choice falls deliberately on the most improbable subject, ensuring that the ensuing narrative would belong solely to the one who chose him. Gideon's response is immediate, a blend of confusion, bitterness, and challenging realism, a voice of the oppressed speaking truth to what he perceives as a divine failure. If the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? He encapsulates the entire national trauma into a single, piercing question. He does not deny the title of mighty man out of false modesty, but out of genuine bewilderment, deeply rooted in his personal experience of weakness and his nation's endless suffering. The narrative, therefore, does not just present a hero's journey. It confronts the very definition of heroism. It establishes the central conflict not merely as Israel versus Midian, but as Gideon's deep-seated self-doubt and the overwhelming reality of the crisis versus the incomprehensible, radical power of God's calling. This reluctant, common man, the epitome of national frailty, is the hinge upon which the great wheel of liberation is about to turn. Before we continue with the unbelievable strategy that sealed the fate of the Midianite terror, we want to take a brief moment to thank you for joining us on this journey through Scripture. If this deep dive into God's power in human weakness resonates with your spirit, please consider subscribing to the channel to help us bring more stories of faith and courage to light. And tell us in the comments below, from which city are you watching this story of the mighty man of valor unfold? Now, Let's return to the moment where the conflict escalates and Gideon's initial opposition is revealed. The divine directive that followed was simple, yet terrifying in its scope. Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? This was the unequivocal call, the moment where the voice of God cut through the noise of Gideon's fear and the silence of the land's desolation. The word might pointed not to the muscle Gideon possessed from a farmer's labor, but to the latent, untapped power of the divine presence he had just received. The calling was not a request, but a commission backed by a sovereign mandate. Yet Gideon, the deeply ingrained skeptic, needed to touch the intangible to ground the spiritual in the tangible. He presented his first wave of opposition, a desperate human need for validation, demanding a sign, a test, a physical manifestation, the offering consumed by fire, before he could accept a mission so completely beyond his capacity. This was the fear of the unknown, the fear of failure, demanding a signature of certainty on a blank check of faith. The deeper opposition, however, was already a cancer in his own household and community. The very system that claimed to follow God was steeped in the comfort of syncretism. His father's altar to Baal, a religious compromise that symbolized the nation's spiritual rot and the root of their oppression. Gideon's first act of obedience, done in the dead of night, was to tear down this idol and the Asherah pole, a direct confrontation with the established false security of the town elders. This placed him immediately at odds with the status quo, branded not as a savior, but as a dangerous radical by those who preferred the silence of compromise to the roar of true covenant faith. The divine message, channeled through this improbable man, was an immediate, visceral threat to the false peace and hypocrisy that had allowed the Midianite terror to flourish. The tension was not just between Gideon and the enemy army, but between God's demand for purity and the people's passive, complicit surrender to idolatry. The moment Gideon blew the trumpet, the call up to arms, it was a sound that had been absent for too long, the defiant sound of faith reawakened, confronting the deafening silence of oppression. Yet, the initial mobilization was quickly overshadowed by Gideon's persistent, agonizing need for assurance. The saga of the fleece, first wet with dew while the ground was dry, then dry while the ground was drenched, was a profound declaration of human weakness standing before divine power. It was Gideon seeking to manipulate the certainty of God's promise, a ritualistic demand for repeated, undeniable proof. This was the deepest denunciation of the human spirit, its pride not in self-reliance, but in its inability to trust the very source of its strength. It highlighted the spiritual deafness of the era, where the simple word of God was no longer sufficient, requiring instead increasingly spectacular personal signs to break through the fog of doubt and fear. The great denunciation then came through the action of God himself, the radical, almost insane process of army reduction. Gideon initially mustered 32,000 men, a number small enough to feel vulnerable, but large enough for the human heart to find a false anchor in its own resources. God's decree was immediate. The people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands. This was the core denunciation, not of Midian's wickedness, but of Israel's impending self-glorification. The true danger was not defeat, but a victory followed by the fatal boast. My own hand has saved me. The Lord was dismantling the possibility of human credit, stripping away the comfort of statistics and the illusion of self-sufficiency before the battle even began. The first 22,000, those who were simply afraid, were immediately dismissed, demonstrating that fear itself is a disqualifier for God's warfare. The second test was even more subtle, a brutal cut from 10,000 down to a mere 300. The seemingly arbitrary nature of the test How they drank water was in reality a profound measure of vigilance and focus. Those who knelt, placing their weapons aside to drink leisurely, were judged as momentarily unconcerned with the ever-present enemy. But the 300 who lapped the water quickly, maintaining their posture of watchfulness, were chosen. The message was clear. God does not want a crowd, but a consecrated remnant, alert and ready. This whole process was a stunning, strategic denunciation of the age-old temptation to rely on numbers, on brute strength, or even on comfortable spiritual practice. It was a loud, divine declaration that the victory would not be achieved by the sword of man, but by the shattering of human conceit. This dismantling leads us directly to the obligatory core principle of the entire narrative, the phrase that must echo in the valley of battle and the silence of the heart, that Israel not glorify themselves against me, saying, "My own hand hath saved me." This is not just a strategic motto. It is the spiritual litmus test for all divine intervention. It fundamentally asserts that the glory of the deliverance must remain completely and demonstrably with God. The true sin being denounced here is the insidious pride that confuses divine blessing with personal merit. The Lord will not share his glory. He must be seen not as a helper to human strength, but as the exclusive source of all might. This process of reduction was thus a vivid, living sermon against the illusion of human control. The people's reaction, or rather, the reaction of the vast majority of the 32,000, was likely one of immediate relief, mingled with confusion and a quick return to their caves. Their indifference to the true nature of the call, their preference for the familiarity of fear over the terror of absolute faith, was itself a form of profound spiritual ritualism, a commitment to safety over the summons of God. They had been invited to witness a miracle of power, but chose the quiet surety of their own homes. The urgency of God's message distilled into the seemingly impossible task given to the 300, only intensified the chasm between the remnant's radical commitment and the majority's comfortable compliance. The 300 stood alone, a final, small testament to the few who dared to believe in a power beyond their own. That Israel not glorify themselves against me, saying, "My own hand hath saved me." The repetition of the phrase at this critical juncture is the final, sharp edge of the denunciation. It serves as a stern, unyielding guardrail against the default human tendency towards self-sufficiency. Every subsequent action, every trumpet blast, every shattered pitcher must be interpreted through the lens of this profound theological assertion. The Lord is setting the stage for a victory so completely irrational, so numerically ludicrous, that only one conclusion can be drawn. The focus is no longer on Gideon's initial timidity, but on the unwavering necessity for God to establish the absolute singularity of his redemptive power. The battle plan is now the denunciation itself. The enemy must be defeated by a means that defies all military logic, guaranteeing the complete removal of human pride from the equation of triumph. The remaining 300 are not, by human standards, the elite warriors of Israel. They are the leftovers, the radically reduced contingent, the absolute minimum required to carry out a symbolic, spiritual action. The denunciation in this context becomes a teaching moment for all of history. When God calls, he removes all competitive elements, ensuring that the vessel is not merely empty, but strategically, overtly incapable of accomplishing the task alone. The great alert is not simply that the Midianites are coming, but that the true battle is for the allegiance of the human heart, to prove that trust in numbers is idolatry, and that true might is an exclusive derivative of divine command. The stage is set for an act of God that will silence all human boasting. The tension has reached its zenith. The vast, menacing darkness of the Midianite camp against the vulnerable Ain exposed light of 300 men. The air is thick with the knowledge that this small group is not a fighting force, but a fragile, intentional display of weakness. The denunciation has worked its effect. There is no possibility of human glory now. The terror of the enemy is matched only by the sheer incredulity of the situation. This overwhelming sense of urgency, the knowledge that any minute could bring total annihilation, is the true climax of the denunciation, driving home the point that the only resource left is absolute, unwavering, desperate dependence on the divine strategy. No matter how nonsensical it appears to the natural mind, before the final impossible command was issued, God extended a final act of grace to Gideon's fragile faith. The Lord commanded him to go down to the Midianite camp with his servant, Purah, essentially offering a reconnaissance mission designed not for military intelligence, but for personal, spiritual encouragement. This was the true climax narrative. Gideon, the terrified leader, overhears a Midianite soldier recounting a dream of a barley cake, the meager, humble sustenance of the poor, tumbling into the camp and overturning a mighty tent. The interpretation given by his comrade was the final, undeniable sign. This is nothing else save the sword of Gideon the son of Joash. For into his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host. God chose to speak through the very enemy, transforming a meaningless dream into a crystal-clear confirmation of Gideon's divine mandate, a point of no return built on an external, irrefutable prophecy. This seemingly small, overheard conversation was the linchpin that finally broke Gideon's fear. The power of the divine intervention was not in a thunderous decree, but in the subtle, perfect orchestration of circumstance, proving that the Lord governs even the private, nighttime thoughts of the enemy. Gideon's response was immediate and transforming. He worshipped. The farmer, the coward, the skeptic was replaced by the mighty man of valor, who finally understood that his victory was already a settled matter in the heavenly courts. This shift in Gideon's internal state was the true preparation for battle, demonstrating that God works first in the heart of the messenger before commanding the action. The burden of doubt was lifted, replaced by the weight of a divine certainty that could finally move mountains. The strategy itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, designed not to defeat the enemy with force, but to terrify them with illusion. The 300 were divided into 3 companies, each armed with a trumpet, an empty pitcher, and a torch hidden inside the pitcher. The simplicity of the tools spoke volumes. No swords, no spears, only the instruments of sound, light, and a fragile, breakable vessel. The imagery was potent. The light of God's presence, the divine authority, the trumpet, was imprisoned within the clay jar of human frailty, the pitcher. The act of shattering the pitcher was a visual, auditory declaration that the human vessel must be broken for the divine glory, the torch to shine forth. This deliberate choice of armament reinforced the core theme, making the battle strategy a walking, spiritual parable. The moment of the midnight assault, the simultaneous blowing of the 300 trumpets, the shattering of the clay jars, and the sudden blinding eruption of light was the moment of full divine action. The enemy camp, vast and comfortable in its arrogance, was plunged into panic. The shock and confusion were magnified by the disorienting, deafening sound and the flashes of light coming from all directions. This was God acting through the circumstances, using noise and light to create an overwhelming illusion of an attack by a massive army. The Midianites, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness and the chaos, turned their swords upon one another. The divine intervention was not a single, grand stroke of a mighty hand, but the perfect manipulation of human psychology and circumstance, turning the enemy's own fear and vast numbers into the instruments of their self-destruction. Gideon, now fully in the role of the intercessor messenger, watched the chaos unfold. His task was complete when he uttered the battle cry, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." He was not the hero of brute strength, but the obedient servant whose voice served as the catalyst for divine judgment. The narrative humanizes the enormous, draining weight of his mission. He had endured the doubt, the fear, the impossible reduction, and the terrifying prospect of confrontation. Now, he witnessed the impossible, the miraculous vindication of a process that had seemed utterly irrational. He stood as a testament to the heavy, exhilarating burden of carrying God's will. The messenger's duty is not to fight the battle, but to ensure that the stage is properly set for God's power to manifest. The sight of the vast army annihilating itself must have been a crushing, awesome realization of the absolute sovereignty of the one true God. The judgment that followed the initial rout was swift, decisive, and directly connected to the prolonged oppression and the spiritual apathy of Israel. The panic of the Midianites turned into a headlong flight back towards their desert stronghold. But the consequence of their sustained terror upon Israel was now a certainty. The inevitable judgment was not merely the loss of a battle, but the complete exposure of the error that underpinned their power, the arrogance of an overwhelming, yet unsanctioned, force. The Midianites had relied on the brute force of their numbers and the cowardice of their opponents, failing to account for the single variable factor of God's intervention. This mass self-destruction in the valley became a physical manifestation of divine law. Every act of oppression ultimately returns upon the head of the oppressor, an inescapable cause and effect of spiritual and moral violation. The full weight of the consequence then fell upon the Midianite princes, Oreb and Zeb, who were captured and executed by the rallying Israelites across the Jordan. This was the final, definitive stamp of the judgment, the decapitation of the enemy leadership, the removal of the head of the serpent that had paralyzed Israel for 7 years. The certainty of this judgment was tied directly to the collective spiritual error of Israel itself, their worship of Baal and their subsequent abandonment to their enemies. God had allowed the Midianites to be the rod of correction. Now, in the act of judgment against the Midianites, the Lord was simultaneously affirming his covenant and exposing the utter futility of trusting in false gods or in the supposed safety of the oppressor's temporary dominance. The core lesson of this inevitable consequence is its universality. The law of cause and effect in the spiritual realm is inviolable. Just as Midian's pride led to their self-destruction, so too was Israel's initial weakness a direct result of their spiritual indifference. The victory proved that the true error lay not in their lack of physical resources, but in their lack of faithful obedience. The judgment against the enemy was a clear, emphatic declaration that no force, no matter how immense, can stand against the decree of the Almighty when he chooses to intervene on behalf of his covenant and to restore justice to his people. Out of the night's chaos and the subsequent rout of the enemy, a profound change of tone emerged. The horror of the judgment gave way to a radiant glimmer of hope, the complete and total cessation of the Midianite terror. The promise inherent in Gideon's calling was now fulfilled. A tangible, undeniable liberation for a nation that had been paralyzed by fear and subjugated by constant invasion. This hope was not a mere political shift. It was a deep, spiritual restoration, a moment where the people were forced to remember the power of the God who saves. The fields would be sown without fear of immediate plunder. The caves could be emptied, and the sound of the flail could be heard openly once more. This physical peace was the external symbol of the re-establishment of the covenant relationship, a proof that the Lord had not ultimately abandoned his people. The ultimate promise, the enduring testimony to God's faithfulness, was the 40 years of peace that followed Gideon's victory. This extended era of rest and recovery was the tangible fruit of a battle won solely through obedience and dependence. It was the Lord proving that his purpose is always restoration and flourishing, even after necessary periods of judgment. The promise was not an annulment of the past judgment, but its ultimate purpose, to purify and to redeem. The 40 years stood as a monument to the principle that God uses the dramatic, the terrifying, and the impossible to secure a lasting state of blessing for those who, however reluctantly, place their entire trust in Him. The victory secured by the 300 became the bedrock upon which a generation could rebuild its faith and its national identity. We return now to the enduring spiritual requirement, recontextualizing the core message in the light of restoration and blessing, that Israel not glorify themselves against me, saying, "My own hand hath saved me." This phrase, now repeated, is transformed from a denunciation against pride into a perpetual caution for maintenance. The salvation had been secured not through their large numbers or superior tactics, but by the shattering of human capacity. The ongoing peace was a gift, a continuous reminder that the power that sustained them was the same power that delivered them. The lesson is clear. The tendency to claim credit and return to self-sufficiency is the greatest threat to sustained blessing and the surest path back to renewed oppression. The peace was not Gideon's legacy. It was the Lord's enduring grace. The final act of the glimmer of hope was Gideon's own refusal to take on the mantle of king, a profound and necessary act of self-denial. When the men of Israel said, "Rule thou over us," Gideon's reply was the perfect summary of the entire narrative: "The Lord shall rule over you." He understood the meaning of the victory. He had been the vessel, the catalyst, but the crown belonged elsewhere. This act of humility cemented the victory's theological significance, ensuring that the entire generation understood that the peace they enjoyed was a theocracy, a rule by God alone. The true restoration was not in a new dynasty, but in the explicit, declared sovereignty of the one who had won the battle. The legacy of Gideon is not in his ultimate perfection, for he was human and fell prey to later errors, but in the enduring power of his initial radical obedience and the principle that governed his great victory. His story, the great idea of the narrative, is the irrefutable truth that true strength is not the absence of weakness, but the total and exclusive reliance on God's power to work through that weakness. Gideon, the fearful farmer, remains the quintessential symbol of the divine strategy. The small, the weak, and the seemingly incapable are chosen precisely so that the glory is perfectly preserved for the Almighty. His life's narrative is a permanent marker against the self-congratulatory human spirit, a testament to the fact that when God calls a mighty man of valor, He is not describing the man as he is, but as He intends him to be. The profound lesson, the timeless spiritual application, for the modern listener pivots entirely on the strategic reduction of the army. The victory was secured when all reliance on human capacity was surgically removed. We must ask ourselves today, what are the Midianites in our lives? The overwhelming anxieties, the crippling debts, the seemingly impossible relational crises, the massive professional challenges. And what are our 32,000 men, the false securities that we trust in, our intellect, our bank balance, our social network, our title? The enduring question from Gideon's Valley is this: what is the clay jar in your life that God is calling you to shatter so that the torch of His power, the light of His glory, can finally shine forth in your impossible situation? This narrative offers a powerful, counterintuitive roadmap to faith. The true battle is won not by acquiring more resources, but by surrendering the resources we already possess that tempt us into self-reliance. It is a radical call to embrace the insane strategy of faith, to take the two items God provides, a simple trumpet, the authority of His word, and an empty pitcher, the emptiness of the self, and act on His command, regardless of how illogical it appears. The victory belongs to those who trade the comfort of human logic for the terror and triumph of divine obedience. The only prerequisite for God's power is the explicit renunciation of human boasting. We conclude with a forceful declaration on the absolute sovereignty of God, the tonal summation of Gideon's entire experience. The God who reduced an army of 32,000 to 300 and still delivered the victory is the God who governs all the circumstances of our lives. He is not constrained by numbers, by logic, or by the limitations of our environment. The salvation, the deliverance, the breakthrough, it is and will always be of the Lord. His power is revealed most clearly, most undeniably, in the moments of our deepest inadequacy, ensuring that when the noise of the battle fades, the only voice heard is that of his absolute supremacy. If this message of justice, surrender, and restoration, built on the principle of finding strength in your weakness, has touched your heart, we encourage you to take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs this encouragement, and subscribe for more deep dives into the Word of God. Click the bell icon to ensure you don't miss our next story of impossible faith. Thank yourself for watching, and may the sword of the Lord and of Gideon bring light to every corner of your life.